Hello, my name is Annie Libertini, and if you're watching this video, you probably got to it from taking my leather rose class on Elk Track Studio, or perhaps from taking some of my other flower classes. Um, when I did the rose class, I had so much content to cover that I wasn't able to fit in all of the information that I wanted to include, including how to make the miniature rose into a pin using this piece, which should be on the pattern, and also how to attach a rose to a wire stem. So this video is kind of an addendum to that, and also should be useful if you've taken one of my other flower classes, particularly when it comes to attaching it to the stem. The process is very similar. So I've got two roses here. I've got my little miniature one that I'm going to make into a pin, and the larger one that I'm going to put on a stem. So I'm going to start with the smaller rose. This pinback piece is is part of the pattern, and it's got two holes in it, a circular hole and an oval one. Um, and those are also in the pattern. They're there so that you can insert a standard pinback like this, which you can get at pretty much any craft store. If you don't have an oval punch for that hole, just if you use a slightly larger size punch, you can do that round. It's the reason the hole is kind of large is because the pinback has this hinge and this extra little piece sticks out, and it just makes it easier to get through there and let it kind of move freely with that larger or oval hole. So I've dyed this, I've finished it, I've done everything I want to do with it, and I've also used scratch all to kind of rough up the leather on the inside of it here, because that's where it's going to be glued, and that'll help the glue really adhere. So the next thing that I want to do is take the pin back and insert and make sure that the hinge end you insert into the oval or wider hole. Sometimes it takes a little bit of wiggling to get it in there just because it tends to shift around. So once you have that piece through, you can kind of jam the clasp end through. There we go. You might have to kind of push. I tried to make the holes not really any bigger than they needed to be, just so it looks a little neater on this side and holds it in well. So I used to always sew pin backs on to my flowers because if you're wearing it as a pin, you really, I don't feel comfortable being completely relying on glue, especially something that you might wear and it might get caught. It might have a pressure applied to it. You wouldn't want it to pop off and fall apart. So I used to always stitch these on, and that is why they have these little holes. But I kind of prefer doing it this way because it means you don't need to stitch it necessarily. You still could if you wanted to, and it just makes the process a little bit simpler. So now that I have the pin back in, what I need to do is apply some contact cement both to this piece and this piece. And I think this is the back side of the leather, so it's already a little bit rough, but I think I am going to take my scratch awl and kind of roughen that up just a little bit. So when you're trying to figure out how much glue, like how much area you need to cover with glue on here, you can kind of set your rose down into this little, it's almost like a little cup, and just sort of eyeball. It's not going to come up that far on here. So you really want to keep most of the contact cement kind of around right down here in the bottom. And the nice thing about contact cement is you can sort of peel it off or in a pinch paint over it if you've got any like little areas that you end up with too much. I am using, well, you can't tell because there's dye all over the label, but I'm using Renia Aqualim 315, I believe. Um, I prefer water-based. Actually, I'm going to shake it. I prefer water-based contact cements just because there's a lot less issues of fumes and needing really good ventilation And if you work in your home like me, you have to think about those things. So I'm going to grab a Q-tip and just get it out of the cap. So, of course, if you're really familiar with contact cement, this is not going to be new information. But if you're not, um, you want to apply a thin layer. You don't want, I'm going to use my finger, it tends to tear up the Q-tips. You don't want globs, so it goes on kind of white, and as it dries it gets clear, like most glue. So you want to make sure you've got enough to cover the area, but you definitely don't want globs because having too much of this glue will actually make it not stick as well. That, sometimes I think it's easy to feel like if the more glue you add, the better it works, but for contact cement, that's not really the case. The nice thing about Renia too is that it for contact cement, normally you always need to apply your glue to both sides of whatever you are gluing together, and then you need to wait a little while, usually only about a few minutes with this stuff, for it to get clear and tacky, and then you apply those two sides together. That is how this kind is the Renio Aquilum also, but it also can adhere pretty well even if you just apply it on one side of your join of what you're going to be gluing together. So I'm using the Q-tip and I'm just putting a teeny bit of glue a little ways up on these little leaf things. I don't want to go too far up because mostly they'll sort of sit free so you can see them. But that'll just let it really have a good kind of grip on this rose, because if you don't have enough area that you have that's glued together, then it's much more likely that it might come out at some point. So I'm going to set these guys aside because I need to give them a couple minutes to start to dry and get tacky. And if you're in a hurry, you can also use like a hair dryer or something to speed it up. But so let's just move over to the rose I'm going to put on a stem. So this rose is constructed the same way as my little one, except my little one has been all glued together already. This one I have already glued this piece, coiled it up and glued it. And actually it was glued before and I pulled it apart, so just ignore this extra glue there. And down here I've used the scratch-all, it's kind of hard to see, to rough up this area because again I will be gluing this into here. But to put it on a stem, I need something to attach the wire to. So what I'm going to do is basically attach the stem to this piece and then glue this part in. And that's nice because it has enough area that it's all glued in that it will be able to stay in there pretty securely. But at the same time, it's not. It just hides where the stem is joined on really well. This piece is not in the pattern, but I made it just to show, if you want maybe a little bit more detail on the back of your rose where the stem is, you could cut out a little piece like this, glue it onto here, and then, put the wire through, and kind of as part of this. Depending on what you're making, I'm going to put the glue on it right now. Depending on what you're making, you may not need or want to add that much detail on the back of a stem, because the kind of stem I'm making, this isn't a rose, it's an iris, but you can see it's floral wire and floral tape, and it can go on and it looks nice. It looks pretty neat. Neat and clean. It doesn't kind of stand out if you're making, say, a bouquet. So depending on how much time and effort you want to spend on adding extra details where your stem is attached will depend on what you're doing with it. If you're making, say, a wedding bouquet or, a group of flowers that is big enough that you will be able to put them all together and the place where the stem is attached is not really going to be visible, then I would suggest probably considering just doing a very nice, clean, basic wire stem, because it's not going to be visible, and it is easy sometimes to underestimate how much time it takes to add some of these little extra touches. Um, so, just to keep that in mind. Now, if you're, say, giving someone, making a single rose that's going to be given as a gift, it's sort of its own object, and the place where the stem attaches and everything is going to be very visible, then it's makes a lot more sense to consider spending a little extra time and cutting out like a little piece like this, uh, so that it just looks a little bit more real. So I've put just a little bit of the contact cement on both of these sides. Just like with this piece, I didn't put it all the way up because I want these to be able to sit and sort of stick out a little bit. Now, this hasn't really had time, but I'm going to see if it'll glue on real quick. There we go. Yeah, this stuff's nice because it gets tacky really quickly. So there, it's just going to give it that extra little bit of realism. Now, I already had 2 holes. They're about maybe about 1/8 of an inch apart. You can see them. I had them punched pretty much centered in this bottom of the rose, and I just really quickly need to punch those through this other little piece because I hadn't done that before. Hang on, let me get a real awl. It'll actually go through, because these are the holes that the wire needs to go through. So obviously now that I'm adding this extra little green piece, that didn't match up at all. I didn't glue these very well. And this extra little green piece, it's going to need to go through both. There we go. So if you've never worked with floral wire or floral tape, which I'm going to be using, it's really easy, and it is really useful. You can find it at probably any craft store. You just look in the floral section. The wire comes in different thicknesses, different gauges. So if you're doing a flower where you want a thicker stem, you can either buy a thicker wire, or I only have this thickness, which I'm not even sure what it is, or you can do what I'm going to do and kind of double up, wrap your tape around multiple pieces of wire to create that thickness. So now that I've gotten this glued on, hopefully I didn't push it off, and these holes punched, I have this piece of wire. I've bent it in half. If I needed a longer one, I could do it a few different ways, but I'm just going to show this because this will still give it a pretty long stem. So I'm pushing each end through here so that it's basically just looped through. You have to make sure the holes are big enough. You don't want them to be excessively big because it'll make it harder for the rose to sit really firmly on the stem. But at the same time, if they're too small, it's going to start to push. There's this green paper wrapped around the wire, and it'll start to push that off, which can make it a little annoying. So you definitely need the holes to be big enough to easily push that wire through. So now I've got it like this, and I'm going to just twist these around the top, but I'm not going to try to twist them. Well, I'm going to twist them first. I'm going to try to get it very tight so I can feel that pulled really tightly. It's nice and secure on here. That's what I want. But roses and most flowers tend to have a slightly thicker area right under where the stem attaches. So I'm just taking one part of this wire, and you can use pliers if it's easier, but I'm trying to snug it right close up to that attachment point, and I just want to coil this around a few times to create a bit of a thicker area. And this does 2 things. It makes it look a little bit more real where it attaches, and it also gives the flower something to kind of sit against, so it's less likely to be floppy on the stem. It sits much more firmly because you've given it this little wedge that's kind of keeping it on there. and it just sits nicer and makes it a lot more adjustable. If you're making, say, a bouquet, you can bend the wire and you don't have to worry that it's just flopping over. So I've coiled that around. I mean, you can do more or less. It sort of depends what you're going for. But for me, I think that looks fine. So this is floral tape. It's really thin. It's waxed. I think it's just waxed like paper. Um, and I'm gonna cut a length of it off just because it's a little easier to work with that way. If you've never worked with it, it's not really sticky. It doesn't feel sticky on your fingers, but as you wrap it around the wire, if you pull on it slightly and stretch it, it helps kind of the wax help it adhere to itself. You want to start wrapping as close to the top as possible because the goal is really to cover that wire um, fully, because obviously wire doesn't look very natural. But you do want to keep pulling the tape. Oops, well, not that firmly because it does tear easily, but it's fine because you literally just stick it back on and keep wrapping. You do want to pull gently on it as you do it, very gently, because that will help it adhere to itself. So you just start kind of tightly wrapping it down the stem. And in this case, I just have these two wires because that's long enough, or that's thick enough, I think, for a rose. Their stems don't tend to be all that thick. If you're doing, say, like the iris that I'll show you again at the end, or depending on a lily or something that tends to have a thicker stem, you might want to add additional pieces of wire, or just buy a thicker wire to work with. But if you wrap it nice and tight, you can't really see that it's two pieces. It looks nice and neat. And for the most part right now, I will say I don't think I centered it very well, but for the most part I find that using the EcoFlow Pro Stain that I use on these, just using the green tends to get a color that's actually pretty close to this floral tape, which is convenient. But if you want to spend the time, you could color your little piece down here, then put on the stem, and then you could always mix up, some green, or I know rose stems tend to be a little bit brown, but you could mix up, the color that you want it all to be, and even use in acrylic, and then even use a little bit of that to, brush onto here and a little bit on the stem, and it could help that blend together if you're not finding it that it's doing it on its own. And here, so it's looking pretty good. And then, of course, the last thing that I need to do with this flower is I need to open my glue again and apply some contact cement to the inside of this and to the outside of this. So I'll put it in there and kind of eyeball. It really does cover quite a bit. Quite a bit of this is in contact when you glue it, but it also depends if you've wrapped your rose more loosely, so it's more relaxed, the petals are more open, then you'll want to make sure to keep your glue a little bit further down so that it doesn't show. If you're doing more of a sort of, it's just past the bud phase and it's very kind of firm and wrapped up like that, then you can put your glue a little higher up and that'll keep it very closed. And of course, anywhere in between. So I'm just going to add a little bit of this, and I've already scratched up the inside of this. So again, I'm trying not to get any little globs, because that's not going to help it stick. And I think I'm going probably about a little bit, or about halfway up the petals for mine, because mine's going to be, it's a pretty tightly coiled up rose. All of its petals haven't started to drop yet, so I can go pretty far up. And actually, well, you just have to ignore the fact that I already had glue on here, so you can even kind of see how far up I went. but I'm just getting it on here so that it can get tacky really quick, and then I'll glue these two together, and that's pretty much the whole thing. Alright, just getting rid of those globs. Alright, so I'm going to set this to the side, come back to our pin really quickly. So this has been sitting and getting really tacky, which is nice. I think it's going to stick really well. So I want to make sure that this gets glued as well as possible. As much surface area is really sticking as I can. So I'm going to hold this in my hand. I've got the pin kind of going down through my fingers, and then I'm going to place that in there the way I want it. Firmly press it down. And I'm trying, to kind of hold the rose in, make sure I'm not flattening it out, but it's pretty well formed, so it's not really going anywhere. I just want to make sure that this is anywhere that it needs to be adhered, that it's really gotten that contact, because it's not only holding these pieces together, but it's also holding this pin back. So even if you have this is a stylus, but if you have like a modeling spoon or something where you could really make sure it gets in on either side of that pin back and it's really in there good. If too much of your pin is showing, oops, I'm going to scoot it over, and you don't like that, you could always glue like a little piece of fabric or soft leather over this join, but it's not really too bad. So there's the pin, that's little leaf, and I think these look, they look really nice. They make it, just that little hint of these little green bits showing, I think makes it look a lot more real. So there's that. And on this guy, I think it's sat long enough. So I'm going to make sure my petals are lined up the way I want them, which means I want to make sure they're offset to each other. There we go. And sometimes you sort of have to look a little bit to figure out the best, there. I don't know. The best way that orientation, that where the petals look really, perfect. So I'm kind of pressing down with this because I'm trying to get it really well glued. I think it's acting a little funny just because I had glue on it before. I just want to make sure it gets that pressure, because contact cement, if you can get it on there and make sure that it gets good contact, it sticks really quickly and very firmly, which is nice. There. Now that I've done that, I can kind of pull some of these out a little bit. You can make some final adjustments. There we go. Loosen it up a little. But that's how I put them on a wire stem. And just very quickly to point out a couple other of the flowers that I've done in classes that you can do, a very similar thing to. This is the iris, and I basically did the same thing with this, except that there's a little, where the wire comes through, it's actually kind of inside there. And I do explain that in detail at the end of my iris class, so you can look that up if you want to make them. Here is a tiger lily, and I can show you how I would do it. I basically did the same thing. I had the two little holes. I looped the wire through. On this one, I didn't make that little loop around. I made this a while ago. If I did it again, I would, because you can actually see it's kind of wobbly. And if I had done that little loop at the top to make that little sort of bud, it would be a lot steadier on the stem. But just like with the rose, once I've done this, I would use contact cement and glue the second piece on, and it hides the attachment of the stem, and everything looks pretty nice. And the last one I've got is here. Oops. Here is a sunflower. It's actually the back part of the sunflower. These ones are so big, there's so much flat area here, that Um, what I did just to make sure it would be able to stay steady on the wire and not flop around, is I did uh, two sets of two holes that were about a quarter inch apart, and sort of crossed it and did four pieces of wire, and kind of put them together. But it's just that the larger your flower is, the more you may need to do, kind of make sure that you've got enough wire spread out over enough area, where it's attached, that it's not just going to be flopping around on it. So of course this needs the other pieces. But the principle for how I do all of them is basically the same. Generally, it means attaching the wire directly to the whatever the bottom layer of the flower is, and then gluing the final layers on to hide that attachment point. Um, so here are the roses, one on a stem and one pin. And of course, you could use a similar principle, using these two holes to add a pin to the back of pretty much any of these flowers. If you had the sunflower and you wanted to put the two holes and push the pin through this bottom layer and then glue the other ones on, or it works for a lot of them. So I hope this was helpful, and I hope you'll be coming back to Elk Tracks to take some more of my flower classes. Thank you very much.